say, the current environment here, I wanted to ask whether you think that LEAP would be a solution for our country, for Catalonia.
If your starting point is that you're thinking in terms of countries, it means your starting point is a path of conflict. On the other hand, if the starting point is, could it be a solution on a small piece of land that's too small and empty to fight over, and then on a basis of self-selection, we could create a space that would have immediate leadership in Europe, and that would mean that young people from throughout Spain could emigrate to their own countries? Absolutely. Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, my question is also about, for Mark Klukman. Yeah. And it's about in which economic sectors are you relying, especially? I mean, which economic sectors are you thinking of when you are talking about these special zones? Of course, for example, Singapore or Hong Kong, isn't it that they are financial hubs? Or Singapore has a really nice harbor in the middle of Asia?
Yeah, and Singapore actually has a surprisingly diverse economy. If you look at the numbers, you see this robust manufacturing sector. Turns out that even for manufacturing, you don't need huge amounts of land. You know, unless you want to get into forestry, you really, you know, or agriculture, it's not about large pieces of land. In terms of Honduras, the country is part of the Central America Free Trade Agreement. So anything that wants to wind up in the U.S. market, it has an advantage, you know, and it's very close. So it's a nearshoring alternative. It's in the same time zone, you know, either of Chicago or Texas, depending on which month of the year it is. No, I guess Chicago and Texas are at the same time. It's in the center zone of the United States. It's 2 hours away, the same two languages. So it's an obvious place to be manufacturing and exporting things to the United States. Already what's taking place is there's certain industries that exist in the various Central American countries, such as textiles, clothing, and companies that are operating those activities in places like El Salvador and Guatemala are starting to think, gee, maybe our expansion or maybe our existing operations should choose this far superior jurisdiction. I mean, if you can get the chance to operate in a first-class jurisdiction and pay third-world wages, that's pretty good. And if you take it a step further, suppose you have a company with a high-value brand, and there are companies in Spain with very high-value brands. That means, you know, you're paying $4 to produce a sweatshirt you'll sell for $150. What you want to be careful about is not to have scandals in your supply chain. So a LEAP zone provides much stronger control and transparency inside of your supply chain. It's worth a lot to you. And if you can do that paying the same wages that you'd be paying in an adjacent country, why not? You also can have, you know, Canadian snowbirds. These are people in the winter want to be where the sunshine is. Tourism. The one I'm interested in is offshore medicine. I think you have some great medical breakthroughs taking place on the research level in Europe, and we'll see when they get approved to actually be delivered to patients and in which countries. What if there was a place in Honduras where you have a special zone which could manage a framework that would be optimized for the operation of medical care in Honduras? So there are many opportunities of that kind. One of the most interesting, the last one I'll mention, is if you simply think of the Hondurans themselves. Everyone talks about remittances. I'm sure there are people in Spain talking about the glory of remittances, and that's fine if it's a country with free movement. But in a place like Honduras, you have people paying to get smuggled into another country. Order of magnitude, you might find there are 50,000 people in a year in Honduras who are paying typically $5,000 to get smuggled in. Do the math, that's $250 million a year. In one 4-year period, you have Hondurans coming up with $1 billion. People say, where do you think the money will come from? I say, why don't you start with the money that's already being spent on coyotes, on the human smugglers? Thank you.
I find it a fascinating description. I didn't know that much about the sedes, but can you explain a little bit in Honduras' case, which is the case you know well, how did they go about creating a completely separate, I'm a lawyer, a separate legal system where I guess the person that's in this zone doesn't have the minimum wage, doesn't have the health protection, doesn't have, or if he doesn't and he can't sue back into his courts, how do you separate that out? How have they gone about it? How do they get competent judges and et cetera? Hong Kong.
Well, the black letter law establishes that the legal regime will be based on sistemas legales anglosajones, Anglo-Saxon law, common law. It stipulates the use, not the obligatory, but the optional use of foreign judges. It establishes that the default regime will be mandatory arbitration. My partners in this project over the years are two very smart lawyers. What's interesting about the project is it's not a project that was put together by economists. It's a project that was put together on the Honduran side. The Hondurans involved are lawyers. They're lawyers, Octavio Sanchez and Ebal Diaz. And it's interesting that Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, a lawyer, I'm not saying that Singapore is paradise on earth, but the understanding that it's rule of law. There's really only one thing. My conclusion is there's one thing and only one thing I found that's scarce. It's not land. It's not capital. It's not infrastructure. It's not technology. It's not human resources. What's scarce are good jurisdictions. There are very few really good jurisdictions, and those few that exist are immensely valuable. And I think, in a certain sense, George Gilder, in his newest book, Knowledge and Power, talks about this. He says, he says that it's not that there's a spontaneous order or an invisible hand that will give you the equivalent of the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council. That involves leadership, it involves vision, it involves an historical process. What we're trying to do in Honduras through institutional leapfrogging, which is exactly the opposite of technological leapfrogging, which makes it easier to remember, I guess. Technological leapfrogging is about what's new. Institutional leapfrogging is more likely to be about what's old. To build a credible institution requires a period of time that exceeds a human lifespan. So because people who think institutions are important should stop trying to build them. Instead, find those that actually work and say, we're going to use them. No, we're not going to copy them. No, we're not going to get them as consultants. No, we're going to use them. We're not going to copy their recipes. No, we're going to use them. That's what Lee Kuan Yew did, okay? You can do it through insourcing, where you can hire them in. So when the Emir of Dubai hires in distinguished magistrates from the UK, New Zealand, and Singapore, he's acquiring this judicial culture and the prestige that was created over centuries. So that's...
I believe there are neighborhood associations in USA. Do you think they manage their own education and security? Do you find any similarities between the LEAP zones and these associations?
I think they have certain administrative characteristics. They're under the governance of whatever the public authority is. They're subject to the same, courts. It's interesting. There was a Liberty Fund colloquium a couple of years ago on this topic of. I don't use the term free cities because that means different things to different people. To such a degree that there were a bunch of readings on homeowners associations. What I find is that the LEAP model is also sort of useful as an analytical tool. It creates a framework for comparing two different models. You can say, okay, this one's Hong Kong, and how are they dealing with these 4 boxes? And this one is Shenzhen, the special economic zone, and how do they deal with these 4 boxes? It's also useful for designers as a template, where there are 4 empty boxes. Okay, what are we going to do about the issue of legal institutionality? Okay, what are our economic rules going to be? Write them down. What's our administrative model going to be? You have your ideas, I have mine. Go for it. What's going to be the political governance model? And you design these things. For example, in political governance models, once you start looking at the world this way, you see, well, what is the corporation of the City of London? It's a shareholder-owned municipality. And what is the authority of the Panama Canal? It's an appointed, it's not an elected authority. And the Federal Reserve Board, that's a 14-year term. That's not exactly designed to move at the speed of elections, is it? No, it's not. And the LEAP zones in Honduras want to attract long-term investment. Why should they be as volatile as electoral politics? They're not.
Regarding the public goods and the private goods, how the idea of that would apply to the famous NHS and convincing British public that actually some sort of co-payment or actually having it privatized is actually a really good idea, where everyone thinks the British NHS is the best thing in the world, at least from people I've met.
Well, it's a good example. I mean, the best thing would to go with these systems to go private. But we realize that this is not the case, and it's a very long march to enter into that. If that is not possible, the option simply is to look at how these systems are handled. It's a public good, and it obviously has. We don't need to go back to the columns and the rows. All these sorts of pairings, sometimes even more complicated, because you have paying users who pay perhaps not fully, only 80% and use 100 or 70. So that would mean that things are getting even more complicated. But you find in all these pairings injustices included. And that should be at least an opportunity to say, if you take your argument seriously, that there should be justice behind public goods, then you have to react to that kind of criticism. And you can do so by simply transforming them into toll goods, so that you pay for what is given or publicly provided, not by the market. Whether that is successful is another story, but I think it's worth the undertaking.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Klugman, Mr. Bouillon, Mr. Carlsberg for the last panel, and thank you to you for your assistance. I think that I expect that we have more reasons today for extending our hope in the freedom are in the individual. Thank you very much, and see you in the next Free Market Roadshow.